absolute worst week of my life was absolutely the best week of my life. It may seem a little strange, but I'd like each of you to consider your own lives. Consider the things that are most important to you, your core values, your strong attributes. And now, or a little bit later when you have some time, I'd like you to think about the experiences that you've had that have so deeply embedded those attributes into your character. The experiences that do come to your mind, I'm guessing, will not all have been easy moments to live through. Many of them will have been difficulties and trials that ended up building you. The story that I'm going to share with you today is an illustration of just how much we stand to benefit from the trials that we face in our day-to-day life, large and small. The Monday of Thanksgiving week last year, my wife and I went in for her final checkup after 9 long months of pregnancy and learned that she was entering the beginning stages of preeclampsia, which, if it was allowed to progress, would turn into a potentially life-threatening situation for both my wife and our daughter. So the doctors decided that we would induce labor that same night. We were in the hospital by 9 o'clock, and by midnight, Nicole was experiencing strong and painful contractions, which gradually intensified all through the night and into the morning. Now, despite all this, the ideal circumstances for childbirth never occurred. And with each contraction, our daughter's heart rate was dropping dangerously low. So finally, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the doctors determined that they would need to perform an emergency C-section. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have ever sat in on a major surgery, but it was terrifying to watch as the doctors pulled at my wife's body and to feel the table shake as they made their way layer by layer down to where our daughter was waiting. And I'm not too proud to admit that when they finally pulled Anna from the womb and she emitted her first cry, I burst into tears. Now, when they handed Anna to us after they had secured her airway, I noticed a familiar look in her eye that I did my best to ignore the whole rest of the day as we got to know her and as family came and visited and congratulated us. And it wasn't until that night, after everybody had left and we were preparing for a long-anticipated moment of rest, that the doctor came in to share a few concerns that she had for us. We had already known from the ultrasounds that Anna's femurs were disproportionately short when compared to the rest of her body. The doctor also indicated that the bridge of her nose was abnormally shallow, and in her right palm, rather than having the 2 lines that most of us had, Anna has 1 line that stretches across the width of her palm. Also, her eyes are slanted slightly upward. All of these were indications that our daughter did indeed have Down syndrome. We were heartbroken and shocked as we considered the lifetime of difficulty that lie ahead of our daughter and ahead of us as her parents. And I didn't know what to do in that moment, and I thought that things couldn't get any worse and couldn't imagine how they would get better. But in that moment, although visiting hours had already passed, I looked up into the hallway, and my dad was standing there with a bouquet of flowers that he had purchased for my wife. I went out into the hallway and explained to him the news that we had just heard. He comforted me, but was quick to remind me of my priorities. He asked if I had offered my wife and daughter a priesthood blessing. See, my dad has always been that way. As I've watched him go through difficulties and pass through trials, he's maintained an outward focus of service. So he and I returned into the hospital room and laid our hands on my wife's head and shared a message which I can only describe as being straight from the heavens. And then for the first time in my life, I took my little daughter's head in my hands and offered her a father's blessing, which was a message of peace and of joy and happiness. And if no one else in the room felt it, I was strengthened in that moment and determined that I would attempt to maintain that outward focus throughout the rest of our stay. And that was despite complications that continued to arise. Nicole's recovery was slow and painful, and Anna developed jaundice, and we had to hold her under a UV lamp for 2 days and through the night. Now, The next time that I'm really stressed out, you'll all know it because you'll notice that I've developed a cold sore on my lip. It happens every time, and it's painful, and it's a nuisance. This particular week, what I had supposed to have been a sore throat on Monday night erupted into a series of similar sores through my entire mouth, all the way from my tonsils to the front under my lip. There are some in our society today who would tell my wife and I that we went through these trials and all of this stress unnecessarily. You see, there are tests that can be done very early in pregnancy that will determine whether a child has a chromosomal disorder such as Down syndrome. And more often than not, the doctor's first suggestion upon a positive finding is to abort that child. Most of the trials that we experience in our lives can be sidestepped one way or another. We can dodge them and get out of the way. But where is the growth in a world where difficulty and disorder no longer exist? During my time of trial, I relied heavily on the example of my grandfather, who had also raised children with lifetime difficulties. When I was a young boy, I watched him pass through what must have been a personal hell to him, beginning when his first son, who had struggled with schizophrenia throughout his life, passed away. And then not 2 years later, he lost a second son, this one who had battled drug addiction since he was a boy. Now, my grandparents, I'm sure, entered a cloud of despair and confusion and concern, and just as they may have been surpassing that trial, my grandfather also lost his wife just months before their 50th wedding anniversary. Now, I observed my grandfather, and even in those times, that smile didn't often leave his face. And he took opportunities to pull myself and his other grandchildren aside and share to us why it was that he was still able to be happy and hopeful during those moments of trial. So I followed a few of his examples as I progressed through this moment of difficulty for my wife and I. And the last point I'd like to make with you as you go through your trials is to introspect. I took careful notes in my journal as we went through this entire process. I prayed more intently than perhaps I have in my entire life in order to gain that same hope that my grandfather had. And when we got home, something that I like to do to try and meditate and really ponder the things that I go through is write music. So I sat down with my guitar and began to write a song which I expected to bear all of the pain and the grief that we had experienced during that week. But I was shocked as a bright and joyous tune began to come forward from my fingers, and as hopeful words came into my mind that uncovered underneath all of that pain a root of sheer joy in the future, in the growth that my family and I would be experiencing, and in the progress that our daughter would make throughout her life as she accelerated towards her full purpose in this life. And now I'd like to share with you just a portion of that song, which I wrote that same week that we returned from the hospital with our daughter in our arms. So give me gold or give me oil, kingdoms, thrones, with all their spoils, better off to cast them deep into the seven seas. I've held the world in these two hands, yes, I have seen the master plan, and in her eyes beheld eternity. That's how the worst week of my life was the absolute best week of my life. Thank you.